This is Chapter 42, Ambulance Operations and Air Medical Response. First thing I want to talk about is driving behavior. I know that the majority of people who work as EMTs and who drive ambulances are probably young males, and I know that young males' driving behavior is very particular. You probably drive faster than you should. You probably take more chances than you probably should. And I'm probably generalizing, but it's, I would say that's pretty much true. And then you drive to work because you're now working as an EMT for a fire department or a private agency, and you pull up in your Hyundai or your Subaru or your Honda Civic or whatever you might be driving, and you climb out of your 3,000-pound Honda Civic and you jump into this 23,000-pound ambulance. And I have to warn you guys, these ambulances, they drive like pigs. They steer like pigs. They brake like pigs. They accelerate like pigs. They're just pigs, essentially. And if you try to drive your Subaru or Hyundai or Honda, or should I say the ambulance, like you would your Subaru or Honda, you're going to get in trouble. And you're going to probably have an accident. So it's really important that you rethink your driving behavior for a number of reasons. One, you don't want to jump in that ambulance and crash the vehicle and then hurt yourself, your partner, and possibly a patient in the back, because now you have three people injured. Also, too, if you're an EMT working on an ambulance, you have an ambulance driver's license from the state of California. And that makes you a professional driver. So anything that you do in your private vehicle, whether it's getting a DUI or getting popped for speeding or getting into an at-fault accident, all goes on your record. And if you do something like a DUI or you have an at-fault accident that's severe enough, it could actually make you lose your ambulance driver's license. And then you would no longer be able to work as an EMT, at least on an ambulance anyway. So how you drive your private vehicle reflects directly upon your professional behavior and vice versa. So it's really important that you recognize that early on. And this is what happens. They get into accidents. Every agency that I've ever worked for pretty much knows this is going to happen for a number of reasons. But if you were to look at the reports of these accidents, and I know the company that I work for right now, they average about 30 ambulance accidents every year, with about 5 to 6 that are serious accidents. And if you look at all of these reports on all these accidents, the majority of these can be related to one of two things. One, probably the most common, is the driver of the ambulance was going too fast for the situation they were in. Or two, they fell asleep at the wheel on the way to the hospital or something like that. That's the majority of the reasons why people driving ambulances get into accidents. There's other little stuff like this. There's fender benders. I'm not talking about fender benders here. I'm talking about serious, boo-boo accidents, essentially. So what it really comes down to is that there's this term called Code 3. And what it means is Code 3 means you're driving with your lights and your siren on at the same time. And when you're driving to an emergency or from an emergency with the patient in the back, going lights and siren, you have a right to do all kinds of stuff we'll talk about here in a minute or so. But their studies have been done showing that if you are called out on an emergency response and you leave your station and the response takes you 10 minutes to get from your station to the scene of the accident, if you go lights and siren, according to the studies that I've read, you only save approximately 60 seconds of time over driving like you would normally drive your private vehicle, stopping at the stoplights and stop signs, using your turn signals and waiting in traffic. So 60 seconds isn't a whole lot. And to be honest with you, I've been in this business about 30 years, and I really cannot recall, there probably was one or two maybe, but I can't really recall a call that I have been on where 1 minute made a difference between the life and death of this patient. So the moral of the story is drive lights and siren because it's required by your department for you to do so, but drive carefully and cautiously. Now, laws and regulations. State of California has laws and regulations. We are governed by Title 13 as well as Title 22 on how we behave as EMTs. The DMV also throws some stuff into this thing, and also the CHP gets involved in this process. So it's kind of confusing, but generally speaking, the agency you're going to work for, whether it's a private ambulance service or whether it's a public, agency like a fire department or lifeguard service, they're going to train you in their own laws and regulations, and they're stricter than the state of California. So even though the state says you can do one thing, you're always going to follow your agency's rules because they're always going to be much more stringent than what the state or DMV might say when it comes to how you operate that ambulance. Now, Code 3 driving. Again, you're going to be dispatched to an emergency and you're going to be told to go lights and siren, Code 3, lights and siren go on. While you're driving to or from the incident, going Code 3, you may exceed the speed limit no more than 15 miles an hour. So that means if you're in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, you can go 40 miles an hour max. If you're on the freeway and at 65-mile-an-hour speed limit, you can do 80, and that's it. Anything beyond that, and you get in trouble, you're in trouble. Now, while you're doing all of this, you can drive the wrong way down one-way streets, you can turn in any direction, you can park anywhere you want to park that you think is pertinent to the care of the patient or accessing the patient. If you encounter a red light or a stop sign, depending on your agency, the state of California says that, and DMV as well, says that if we're approaching a stop sign, we slow to 15 miles an hour. As we approach that stop sign, we're going to make eye contact with all the other vehicles in that intersection, make sure they all see our presence, make sure they all recognize we're there, and then proceed cautiously through that intersection. It also applies to red stop lights as well. Now, your agency might say something differently. They might say they want you to stop completely at a red light or completely at a stop sign, then make eye contact with the other cars, people in the cars, and then proceed through. So you would just follow the more stringent rule that your company's made. Now, driving on city streets is one thing. It's pretty straightforward. I'm sure you guys, when you got your driver's license at the DMV, I'm guessing one of the questions was, you're driving along and what happens if you see an ambulance coming, or it's coming up behind you, or it's coming the other way, what do you do? And we all know that we're supposed to pull to the right and come to a complete stop. The problem is I'm sure you've probably seen, not everyone does that. But that's what we're supposed to do, and I got that. Now, one thing that the DMV and the CHP doesn't really directly talk about is Code 3 driving on the freeway. So normally what you would wind up doing is if you're stationed, most fire stations, most ambulance service stations are on city streets. So you're going to use your lights and siren to get from your station to the on-ramp of the freeway. You're going to turn off your lights and siren, and you're going to proceed up the ramp like you normally would. If the freeway is flowing freely at its normal 180,000 miles an hour, it usually does here in San Diego, there's really no reason to have your lights and siren on the freeway. Just merge over onto the fast lane, get it up to that 80 miles an hour, and go until you get to the off ramp that you need to get off on. Once you transition back over and down that off ramp, you get back on the city streets, you turn your lights and siren back on, you proceed to the scene. If the accident is on the freeway, you're probably going to have a backup like you see here. And this does play a bit of a role because if you come onto that freeway, lights and siren, screaming lights and siren on the freeway, these people are not going to know what to do. Some are going to go right, some are going to go left, some are going to stop dead, some are going to swerve. It turns into just a mayhem. So we really don't want to cause more accidents. And you're going to have to decide how you want to do this. Everyone's got their own idea about this. But if you can turn off your lights and siren, turn on your orange hazard flashers, and just sneak down the little side lane right there, and just sneak down the side lane and get down to the accident. And then when you're at the scene of the accident, you can flick your lights and siren back on to merge across to wherever maybe the accident's in the center divider in the lane one over there, and that's fine. If you absolutely have nowhere to go and you've got to get into those lanes, all those cars, I would probably pick I'd go between lane I guess it'd be lane 4 and lane 3. So those two rows on the right there, and what I would do is I would go between those two lanes and I would force the right lane over into that open space right there on the right hand side. That's another way of doing it. So ultimately, is you don't want to go blaring onto the freeway. Turn everything off, see what you've got, and then proceed cautiously. You don't want to cause any more accidents. So there's a term you need to know. It's called due regard, and this is actually written into Title 13 as well as the DMV regulations as well. And this is the definition. You can read it right there. And the idea is that as a professional driver, and honestly, everyone, whether they're professional drivers or they're just driving themselves to work at 7-Eleven or whatever, should really exercise due regard for everyone else around them. But of course, we don't, because we're human. But as a professional driver, you are legally obligated to exercise due regard. And so what that means is you're driving your ambulance, whether it's lights and siren or whether it's just driving the ambulance from one place to the other, and you do everything possible in your power to prevent an accident. If someone does something stupid in front of you, rather than blaring your horn and trying to force your way through, you would just come to a stop. You would just wait till the stupid people move on and you would proceed through. Let's say you're going lights and siren to an accident and there's dead people and there's body parts everywhere and everyone's screaming and wailing. It's a really true emergency. And you're going lights and siren down this road and there's just someone in front of you who's not pulling over for you. They're blocking your way. And really the best thing to do at that point is, if they're not pulling over, the best thing to do is just shut everything down. Let them find their own way wherever they're going, left, right, straight, whatever it might be. Once they're clear, then you would proceed with your lights and siren. That's kind of like due regard. You're trying to avoid an accident, basically. Now, most common place for collisions are intersections for a number of reasons. Usually it's because someone's driving too fast. Someone doesn't see the ambulance, and I know it's hard to believe this bright red or yellow or green or whatever color your ambulance might be, with all the flashing shiny lights and all the sirens blaring, but people, they see, but they really don't see. You know, we're kind of wired not to see these things. Another problem with all this is too, if you work downtown, like downtown San Diego or New York or some of those larger cities where if you go to the view of the corner is blocked by the buildings. So you got to be a little more careful downtown, like downtown San Diego or downtown LA. There's also another thing that we run into, no pun intended, sorry, are Opticom issues. Now, those of you who are not familiar with Opticoms, you might look up carefully when you're driving, carefully of course, look up on the light standard and there's going to be this little black or green little kind of like thing sticking up. And that's an Opticom sensor. And on the front of every ambulance and every fire truck and every rescue vehicle, there's an Opticom strobe light, and it flashes like 300 times a minute. And what it does is it sends a message to that little sensor, and the sensor turns a red light green for you. The problem with all this is it takes a while. I mean, from the time that thing recognizes your presence, you've got to be about maybe a block away. Maximum distance, probably a block away. Now let's say you're going 40 miles an hour. So you're going to cover that block pretty quickly at 40 miles an hour, or 50 miles an hour, whatever you're doing for the speed limit there. So you have to give this Opticom time to do its job. If you just keep going 50 miles an hour up to this intersection, you're not going to give the Opticom enough chance to change the signal from red to green for you and to change the opposing signal from green to red for the other traffic, and to give that other traffic time to recognize a change in signal and to either clear the intersection or come to a stop. So you would do the same thing. You would slow down to 15 miles an hour, and you would just slow down and you'd wait for that Opticom to do its job. It changes the light to green for you. You're still going to remain at about 15 miles an hour. You're going to approach the intersection. You're going to make sure everyone's come to a stop. Everyone recognizes there's this change in the traffic patterns in the intersection and proceed through. If you barrel through without waiting for the Opticom to catch up with you, that's a bad thing. There's been a lot of accidents, both fire trucks and ambulances, caused by that problem. Now, warning devices, just really briefly, you've all seen ambulances before, maybe you've ridden in them before. They're kind of bright and shiny for obvious reasons, so people can see them even though they don't. And warning lights, all ambulances have some type of warning, emergency lights, flashing lights. The headlights will flash back and forth, and they have all different kinds of strobe lights and all kinds of stuff. And there's just purely just to get people's attention, like, here we are, don't hit us, please. And sirens. Now, again, this depends on your agency. Generally speaking, though, again, if you have your siren on, you have to have your lights on and vice versa. And this is usually the most common policy that we see out there for private ambulance services. The state of California says something a little different. The state of California says you can have your lights on, meaning your emergency lights flashing, and you would just use your siren as necessary. But again, your agency is going to probably be a lot more strict than that, and they're going to say both have to be on at the same time. Again, I'm sure you've heard about what's called the Doppler Effect, where you can actually outrun, you're going so fast, you can outrun the sound of your siren so no one can hear you. And of course, these modern cars, these modern personal vehicles, they're very well insulated. People have their iPod earphone things on, and they're blaring loud music, and they're just not going to hear you. And we're not wired to see ambulances. We're not wired to see things. People will look right at an ambulance and not even recognize its presence. So you have to use due regard and say, I'm going to drive like I'm invisible. Yeah, and if there's any motorcycle riders out there, but the best way to survive riding a motorcycle on the street, here in San Diego especially, is you drive like you're invisible, that no one can see you, because even though they're looking at you, they're not seeing you. So if you drive an ambulance like you're invisible, like no one, even though I got my lights and siren on, I'm going woo 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 code 3, they still aren't seeing you. If you drive as if you're invisible, you'll survive a lot longer. Now, air horns. Every ambulance and fire truck has some form of air horn. And we don't use it very often. Usually it's to get someone's attention. It's kind of outside that sound of the normal siren sound, and it kind of wakes people up because it's pretty loud. But like any other language, it really is a communication device, and what you say and how you say it is very important. Because remember, we're public servants. Even though we work for a private company, possibly, we still serve the public, and we still have to maintain some kind of decent rapport with the community. So, air horns, you have a choice here. So let's say you're driving lights and siren to a CPR, and there's a guy ahead of you, and he comes to a dead stop. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know whether to go left or right, so he just stops. So you can be nice, and you can go, ah, ah. And that's just kind of like, you hit your air horn a couple of seconds like that, and that's just, sir, we're behind you, would you mind moving over? I don't care which way you go, left or right, but just move over out of my way. And that's good communication. That's good public service communication. Now, if you use the air horn, in the wrong way, you're in that same circumstance, and you pull up behind this guy and you go, ah! That's more like get the hell out of my way, dirtbag. That's a little different communication. We try to avoid that if possible. Because remember, we have this, public face that we have to maintain because for obvious reasons. So what's going to happen once you get a job as an EMT? You'll be assigned a shift, 12-hour shift, 10-hour shift, 24-hour shift, whatever your agency uses. And you want to get to your start of shift, usually about 15 or 20 minutes before your start time, especially if you're relieving an off-going crew member. So if you work a 24-hour shift and you're supposed to be there at 7 o'clock in the morning to relieve the person who's going home, if you get there 15 minutes early and they get that late last-minute call, you can jump on that box or fire truck and they get to go home and go back to sleep. So it's just good common, courtesy when it comes to your coworkers. So you're right. You get to work. You're in full uniform. You have everything you need to start your shift. You've got your food, your jacket, your equipment, your uniform, whatever you might need. You get your pagers and keys and radios, however that works, and you go to the ambulance, and you and your partner, because you have a partner, you check out the rig. You make sure that the thing starts. That's always helpful. You make sure that it has fuel of some form, whether it's gasoline or diesel, depending on the circumstances. You make sure that there's no new dents or scrapes on it that need to be reported. And then you start it up, make sure all the lights and sirens work, make sure the brakes work, all the fluids are up to snuff and all that. And then maybe your partner goes in the back, and once that's done, you and your partner will check out all the gear, all the equipment, the backboards and the scoops and the airway bag and the BVMs and oxygen supply and all that stuff. And even though you are on that exact same ambulance yesterday, and it's been sitting all night without any crew, and you come on the next morning to that exact same ambulance, think about what might have happened during the night. Another crew that works the night shift might have been short supplies, and out of convenience, they just pulled up alongside your ambulance and started grabbing supplies from your ambulance. It's not that uncommon. So even though you're on that ambulance 5 days a week or 4 days a week, you should check the rig out every single morning start of shift, because things go missing, things show up that shouldn't be there, and that's your job. It's your professional and legal responsibility to do that. Once it's all checked out, of course, ready to go, then of course you go in service and let the dispatch know that you are ready to respond to whatever call you might have. So they might post you to a location. You might be in the station, depending on your circumstances. They're going to give you a call at some point. You're going to go responding. They're going to give you an address or a location. That's the most important piece of information that you ever will need, because you want to go to the right place. And don't be surprised that the address or location they gave you, even though it's the one they gave you, it might still be the wrong address. It does happen once in a while. When you arrive on scene, you find that it's the wrong address, just let dispatch know. They'll make a call back and try to find where you're supposed to be, essentially. Once you're at scene, you're going to let them know that you are at scene, and if this is a traffic accident or a fire or something like that, you're going to do a scene size up to dispatch, let them know what you have, how many patients you might have, things like that, resources you might need. You're gonna safely get out of the ambulance, the fire truck. You're going to check out all your patients. You're going to start treating them. You're going to load them up. On the route to the hospital, you're going to treat your patient or patients, and then you're going to do a radio report to the hospital, let them know you're coming. You get to the hospital, you turn them over to a doctor or nurse. You get your paperwork signed. While you're doing that, your partner is cleaning up the ambulance, restocking whatever you might have used. So if you have an airway bag or a trauma bag, then if you've used Curlex or 4x4s or Band-Aids out of those, or like an OPA or another mask or something like that, then they would pull those supplies from your bins in your cabinets, and they would replace in that portable equipment. As soon as that's all done, probably take about 20 minutes, 30 minutes to do that. You're back in service, and then you post it back to wherever you were stationed, and you're ready for your next response. Now, air medical transport. We have some choices here in the county of San Diego. Reach Helicopter and Mercy Helicopter, those are private for-profit helicopter services. Reach, it goes out of the airport in Oceanside. It is dedicated to Oceanside Fire, but it can be pulled down into the other parts of the county when Mercy is busy. Mercy Copter, I believe, is at Brown Field still. I'm not too sure about that. Um, these are for-profit ambulance helicopters, and to fly as a patient in one of these helicopters, it's somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 to the hospital. So we use these as EMTs. We only call these helicopters when we absolutely think they will benefit the patient. Now, we'll talk about the reasons why we're going to call for these copters. Remember, there is a cost factor to all this. You don't want to fly somebody for no good reason because that's a big bill. These are also finite resources. There's only 2 of them in the county, and the next one I think is out in Imperial County. So we only want to use these copters when absolutely necessary. And both of these helicopters, I believe, also are used for interfacility transports as well. These are non-emergency air ambulance transports that are pre-scheduled. For instance, a person who needs a heart transplant at Palomar Hospital in Escondido has to be flown to a hospital in Los Angeles or Orange County for the transplant. They would fly them up there. It's pre-scheduled. So we want to leave these ambulances available for all that stuff and only use them when we absolutely have to. If both of these ambulances are not available or they're not appropriate for the situation, we could look at what's called Copter 1 or Copter 2, on the one on the upper right side. This is a San Diego Fire's copter service. They call it a county copter. What's nice about this helicopter is it has lifting capabilities. It has a crane or winch system, so they can hover over a remote area. They can lower a Stokes basket. You can load the patient into this basket and lift them up without them ever having to land. It's staffed with a medic, a paramedic, a City of San Diego paramedic firefighter, so they can have some treatment anyway, and then usually they're transported to a ground ambulance. So they'll fly a mile or 2 or 3, they'll land somewhere in a parking lot, and the ambulance will pick up this person from the helicopter, and then they're ground transported to the hospital. That's a great resource for those wilderness type of Cowles Mountain or those wilderness types of calls, or even like off the cliff somewhere in San Diego. The other one, of course, is the Coast Guard. They can also lift people as well. They usually have a corpsman on board. We only usually use these in certain circumstances, but they are available potentially. It's also, I think, it's also sheriffs as Astria, and I believe they're staffed with EMTs. And I do not know whether they can lift or not, but that's another resource. So again, not a lot of these helicopters in the county for us to use, so we only use them when we absolutely need to. Now, when to request. So if you have a very seriously injured patient or multiple serious injured patients, that's a great choice to call in a helicopter. These people are critical, it's life-threatening, and we want to load this person, the most critical patient, into the helicopter, and we want to get them to a trauma center. And usually what's nice about the helicopter is it's staffed by a nurse and a paramedic, and they have advanced care on board. So the nurse can do a lot of different things that even a paramedic can't do, much higher level of care. So if you get this really critical patient into this helicopter, they can start treating them en route, and they can fly them to a further trauma center. So let's say this accident occurred in Escondido. And in Escondido, there's a trauma center. It's called Palomar Hospital. But because of the fact that you have multiple patients, you want to take the sickest person and you want to fly them to the next closest trauma center because they can get there pretty quickly. And then the other trauma patients can go to Palomar. So you're kind of backfilling the hospitals, the further out, working your way in towards where you are. It's a little complicated, but you guys get the idea, hopefully. Prolonged extrication. So if a person entrapped in some way, they're trapped in a car or trapped on the side of a mountain or something, and it takes longer than 30 minutes to get this person out of their entrapment, you might consider thinking about this might need a helicopter. If you truly think this is going to reduce transport time, then yes. One of the problems is that we have a lot of trauma centers here in the county of San Diego. Hopefully we already talked about this in other lectures, but we're never more than about 20 minutes away from any trauma center, pretty much anywhere we are in the county of San Diego, with the exception of maybe Alpine or something further out like that. So if we can, drive the patient to the hospital, it's probably better for the patient. But if you're somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, or there's heavy traffic, and you're not going to make it to the hospital within 30 minutes, then you might consider the helicopter. Again, when it comes to having that ability to lift the patient off the ground without having to land, so if you can't get up into this hilly area or wooded area, a helicopter can do that. That's great. And of course, if they need that specialty skill, they need that nurses, that advanced care the MICN nurse can provide during the flight to the hospital. Now, when not to call, Mercier and Reach do not transport cardiac arrest patients. So they'll land. If you call in, let's say you have a car versus pedestrian out somewhere in, out in Ramona somewhere, and the person's in cardiac arrest on the ground, and you're doing CPR, and you call in a helicopter like Mercier or Reach, they'll land, the nurse will get out, they'll do some minimal treatment, and then they will pronounce the patient, and they'll go to the coroner's office. So then the MICN nurse on the helicopter has the ability to pronounce patients at scene. It's in the county protocols. So they do not transport cardiac arrest, so don't call them, essentially what it comes down to. And again, like I said before, if it's faster to get to the hospital by ambulance on the ground, we'll just go figure, right? Do that. Violent patients, I hope that makes sense, because would you really want some psycho patient to go psycho while you're 8,000 feet up in a helicopter? Probably not. So this person's violent, he wants to kill everybody, he needs full restraints, probably not a candidate for air transport. And stable patients who do not need extrication or any significant treatment. So this is going to be the person who's, I know there's that place out in the desert, Glamis, however you pronounce it. There's always accidents out there, RVs and motorcycles and three-wheelers and dune buggies and all that. And you get the motorcyclist, he drinks a little too much, or the dune buggy person go too many beers on under the gut here, and he crashes. He's totally stable, but he did have an accident. He did lose consciousness, but his vital signs are stable. He's awake, he's alert, he's talking to you. This person does not need air transport, even though it happens pretty frequently. It's more of a convenience thing for the first responders than it is a patient care issue. And there are certain agencies that just fly people because they don't want to drive any great distance to the hospital, so they just call a helicopter, and they palm them off on the helicopter, and then they go back home, and the helicopter flies the person to the hospital, and then the guy's stuck with a $60,000 medical bill that he didn't really need. When it comes to requesting a helicopter, if it's really socked in, lots of fog and heavy rain and all that, they're not going to fly. They don't have the ability to, at least Reach and Mercier doesn't have the ability to fly. And I think they have to have at least a 3,000-foot ceiling. Don't quote me on that, but something along those lines. If you're way up, if you're way up on the side of a 14,000 feet up, of course, the higher up it is, the less chance they have of making it. A lot has to do with the size of the helicopter and the weight of the helicopter and all that stuff that I probably couldn't really talk about. And it's also the size of the patient. If you have a 400 or 500, 600-pound patient, they're probably not going to be able to take them. So if you have a large patient like you see in the picture here, when you do make a request for Reach or Mercier, say, hey, our patient's 485 pounds. can you handle that particular patient? And they're probably going to say no, but it's entirely up to them. So again, and when it comes to prepping your patient for transport, both Reach and Mercier have specific types of, there's a track system in the helicopter. And what happens is the side door will open, they'll land the helicopter, they'll want you to approach, they'll either wave you into approach, they'll open the side door, and this metal track comes out like a train track. It pulls out, and this like plate comes out, and they want the patient to be on a spine board. Even a medical patient, they want them to be on a spine board, and you strap the person to a spine board, whether it's medical or trauma. You slide the spine board onto this little tray, they clip it in place, and then this track system goes back inside the helicopter, and now it's in line. Now it's in line front to back with the copter. Now it's no longer perpendicular to the copter position, tail to nose essentially. So usually they want this person in some kind of spine board so they can secure them to the helicopter for flight. It's federal requirement. Landing zones, you can read up on this. Ultimately, what's going to happen with this is when you recognize the need for a helicopter, you're going to call dispatch, and you're going to say you're requesting a helicopter, and they're going to simultaneously dispatch a fire truck or a battalion chief to your scene. And the captain on the fire truck or the battalion chief is going to be the ground control person for landing that helicopter. So they're going to oversee the landing zone, they're going to oversee prepping it, they're going to oversee talking to the helicopter and getting them to the right location. It's not really your job, it's going to be the job of the captain or battalion chief to do that. Security and safety, just a couple of things. The last thing we talk about here is vehicles and safety. There's been a lot of talk about this in the last few years, and we've had some issues with this. We've had a number of ambulances stolen over the last 10 years. Maybe a half dozen ambulances that were stolen. Some were found, some were never found. And the number one thing is the keys were left in the ignition. Number one thing, what we're having now is because of all this COVID stuff, we're having ambulances being broken into for the PPE. People break in for the masks and the gowns and all that stuff that we have in there. And then along with that, if your personal stuff's in there, they steal that as your backpacks, they steal that as well. So it's really important to keep your ambulances locked at all times when you're away from them. And just make sure that what you do have in there probably isn't too valuable, because it might just happen. When it comes to uniforms, couple things. So we had a case about 3 or 4 years ago where a gentleman walked into a uniform supply store in Escondido, and he said he wanted to buy 5 firefighter uniforms. And the clerk in the store said, well, what department are you with? And he says, well, I don't really care. I just want 5 firefighter uniforms. And a little argument ensued, and the guy walked out. Well, that's kind of suspicious. There's a concern that if someone does get a hold of a firefighter or EMT uniform, they could use it to access a hospital or some public building, and then have it, there'd be a terrorist attack. So if you are wearing your uniform, and let's say you have to get it replaced, because after a while, after about a year or two, your uniform needs to get replaced. You can't just give it to the Goodwill. It's got your name on it. It's got your badge number on it. It's got your patches on it. You basically have to destroy these identifying badges and patches, tear it up essentially, or cut it up with scissors before you throw it in the trash. It's unfortunate, but some will get their hands on it and use it for badness. Just the way life is.